Hi, I'm Keith Deason, and today we're going to turn these old shelves from a library into a butcher block style modern coffee table. Now, most of this build, if you're not looking at plans, just appears to be cutting the strips to shape, gluing the strips together, and then sanding all the strips. And you're absolutely right. And that's on purpose. Let me explain. A while back, I built a modern coffee table inspired by Danish modern furniture called the flak table. It was an ambitious design, and it was difficult to build, but it was a prototype. I just needed to see if the table could be built as I designed it, if the design had any merit, and then if it could be iterated upon. My goal is to eventually create a version of this table that is buildable by almost anybody of almost any woodworking skill set. And let's take a minute to look at the ugliest stop block ever made. It's ugly, but it works. Coincidentally, it's ugly but it works also sums up all of my shop builds. So while the original version of this table was very difficult to build, this version is not. I would say any intermediate woodworker with a miter saw could probably make this perfectly. That being said, I screwed up all sorts of stuff. Mostly because I milled these strips out of larger pieces of wood that weren't exactly uniform in size or shape. I ended up with a few bits of slop in my cuts. And this was fine for me because I was building this one for myself, not to sell or not for a client. It's a proof of concept for the type of joinery that you see me setting up right here. By staggering the lengths of the strips of wood on this panel, I effectively create a faux finger joint. This is a great way of getting the strength of finger joints with a little extra work if you don't want to use some sort of fancy table saw jig or a table saw at all. And it's in two separate halves right now, more on that later. Now, I thought up a jig for my bench top after I glued up my panel, but you can see how it works here. I just took a cut off end of one of the angled boards and glued it perpendicular and stapled it down to the bench so it wouldn't go anywhere. I didn't do such a good job with the whole 90-degree part, but I didn't need the jig, it was just a thought. But if you're having trouble with alignment, feel free to make one for yourself. So this is why I glued up that top in two halves, because one whole piece would not fit through my planer. Then we stick them together and we've got the top, which is our first side. Now the boards I used were, or should have been, a standard 3/4 inches, and I cut them to 1 inch wide. So this can be built easily with plywood or dimensional hardwood from a home center. It'll probably actually turn out better than mine, considering, like I said, that I had some issues with the planer and the actual thickness of the wood, which caused some irregularities in my glue ups. And I only had to do a glue up on one panel, because the way I decided to go after that was just to cut each individual strip and use my pin nailer so I wouldn't have to use 5 million clamps and have the project take 6 years. And if you're building along or using this as some sort of add-on to the guide, then you can see exactly how I did that here. It's just a lot of careful placement, making absolutely sure every surface is glued and nailed properly, and that, you don't screw it up. And if you want to use any sort of fastener instead of clamps like I'm doing here, don't worry too much about them showing on the outside, because there is a whole nother layer to be added at the end that covers this all up. And really, once you get going on this part, it is this over and over again, making sure you don't screw up forever. So you just turn some music on and enjoy these crazy camera angles I came up with. Alright, yep, and so on until the case is built. The angle of the legs is the same as the angle of the outside corners of the cabinet, because that's just good design. The legs also have a small taper that I just eyeballed for this project, but I'm going to have more precise measurements in the build guide. This is one way to make a quick tapering jig. I'm not saying it's the way you should do it, but it is a way you could do it if you are comfortable working this way with tools. If you are not, do not attempt. So I didn't like the way these legs turned out, even though I built them and fit them onto the table. I didn't like the positioning for them, I didn't like how thick they were, and I did not like how steep the taper was. So I fixed all of those things off screen, but I used the same exact process to redo them, as you see here. Also, this is a pretty sweet shot. It's one of those stuff your phone in the rafters and hope it doesn't fall down into the table saw blade shots, but it's worth it. And here I am cutting the legs down to size, down to thickness. Just imagine though that they are the actual legs that I ended up using. Just do it for me. So I use additive construction as opposed to wood removal to create the joints on these legs, just like we did with the fake finger joints in the carcass. So basically you have to cut 8 legs, and on 4 of them you're going to measure and mark the position where it touches the carcass when it is properly aligned. Like that. And then, according to those lines, you chop it up. Making sure to cut to the waist side of all your marks, that way you won't accidentally shorten the leg. And here we have the beauty of additive joinery. Boom, dados, without having to cut actual dados. And if you're going to use fasteners at this point, I recommend shooting them or drilling them through the back side of the legs. Otherwise they're going to show on the front, and you're going to have to fill the hole, and it never looks right. He says, right before he shoots through the front of the legs on video. And you can see in these shots where on the inside not all my boards line up that great. Like I said, I had some thickness issues. Get your mind out of the gutter. And for me, I was okay taking care of it the best I could later with a belt sander. Not the most elegant process, it's better to get it right in the first try, but you know, what you don't get right in the first try, you could probably fix with a belt sander. And I guess since I don't have much to say about building the legs other than, hey, watch me build the legs. Hey, watch me build the legs. Isn't it just so relaxing watching me work? I think so. Sometimes I even nod off a little bit during the voiceovers, but we'll just keep that between you and me. Speaking of voiceovers, I don't know if you guys enjoy them or not. I enjoy doing them. I don't really try to give a step-by-step description of what I'm doing in the videos. I just like to ramble a little bit, pick out the high points, and talk about why I'm doing the stuff I'm doing. And sorry, there's, a whole bunch of noise in the background of me doing the voiceovers, but I live in a world that is, the world. So, there's noise in it. So I've got the legs built, even though they're the wrong legs, and later I build the right legs. You see how ugly this outside taper is here? What the heck was I thinking? Yeah, any minute there, dude. No one's waiting on you. There you go. And we go from drab legs to fab legs. And the last phase of this build is the outside strip that covers up all the crimes and mistakes that went on the inside. Or it would if I hadn't used a nail gun to attach them, and just used clamps or bandy clamps or, I don't know, a whole bunch of books, which would have been poetic because these were library shelves, right? And yes, before anyone else mentions it, I see the nail blowout in that board right there. But don't worry, belt sander. Anyway, this step is essentially just marking and cutting and gluing and marking and cutting and gluing and making sure that you have a consistent pattern all the way around the piece and it looks all nice and awesome. You guys don't need me to narrate marking a piece of wood and then cutting it and then fitting it into place, right? I didn't think you did. I mean, look, I said 90% of this video is just repetition, and that's because I wanted this project to just be 90% repetition so that it wasn't super skill-based, and it wasn't what kind of tools you had and how well you know how to use them. It was just how well can you follow directions and how consistent can you be. And speaking of consistency, you see it, you love it, you know exactly what it is. Here's the belt sander. Just sanding away the crimes. And by the way, if you thought this was a delicate carcass, these joints hold up really well. This thing is beefy and beautiful. Oh, and you'll notice I have not attached the legs permanently because exactly this step was coming up. Now on the last version of this build, I rounded off the outside corners of the carcass. And on this one, I didn't think I was going to do that until while moving around it in my shop, I literally drew blood by bumping into it 2 or 3 times. So we rounded off. And this is a rough rounding, which I fix later with this kind of hand sand stick thing that I got going on. Gets in those nice hard to reach places. And also by using the random orbit sander. By the way, I really love this section of the table and the way that side just kind of folds down into that crevice. It's kind of beautiful, if I do say so myself. What's not beautiful is the camera bouncing every time I touch my workbench or attach a nail because I was dumb enough to put my tripod on my workbench. Anyway, here's the finished carcass, post-sanding, and pre-finish. Did I say post-sanding? I meant mid-sanding. My bad. Also, I used the random orbit to bring it up to about 220 and knock off all the sharp corners. So the finish I chose is something that I use for cutting boards. I just kind of had an idea that I might make this piece look cool. It's not the most durable thing, and I'm going to have to reapply it a lot, and I would recommend really choosing a furniture finish if you wanted to. But this was also fun. It's a 50-50 mixture of beeswax and mineral oil. And I chose it because it would look great on camera. And it does, because maple looks good with this finish. And there we have the Flak Table 2.0. More iterations to come down the road, but for now this is my favorite. This turned out so well, and it was so easy to build. And it looks really good in place in my crazy shop living room. So that's it from me, VoiceOver Man. You can subscribe to this channel and see these builds all the time. If you don't like hearing me talk, you can visit my Instagram, @KeithDecent, where I don't talk at all because it's mostly pictures. Or if you love hearing me talk or just learning about the things that we use to build things, check out my podcast, From the Ground Up, at ftgupodcast.com, where I talk a lot. Until then, later, makers.